Hey, what is going on everyone? It's me, Mr. Mario, and in this video here, we're going to be revisiting our good friend or friends here, the GameCube, and we're going to be installing a mod chip, which is pretty cool, because it's not going to be like the typical drive chip that we've seen with the GameCube with XenoGC. No. We're going to actually be using this right here, which is a Raspberry Pi Pico, and we're going to be repurposing it by installing PicoBoot on here, a new and incredibly awesome development from developer webhdx. Now I do just want to talk a little bit about this and the prerequisites and everything that you will need. So why is this so cool and so much more important than any other modifications? Well, this one, as opposed to modding the drive board, actually modifies the GameCube console itself using IPL injection, meaning initial program load. Now, even taking a little bit of a step back, this is mainly what you want to do for the GameCube. Now, typically, what people have been doing for a while now, and it's not like these mod chips have not existed, but these are just the most popular ones. This here is a GameCube's optical drive, and typically what you would do is you would take your GameCube apart, take this drive out, and on the bottom of the board, you would install a chip to the board itself, hence why I said drive chip. Now that is called the XenoGC, and what that allows this to do is to play imported games from other regions as well as games burned onto a DVD. So typically you would take your drive board itself, you would modify that. You do not modify the console itself, you really just modify the drive board. You then get your games that are burned onto a mini DVD. While this is a mini CD, I'm still just going to use it for the demonstration here. You burn it over to one of these discs, and then you would pop it in and you would be able to play. Now, that's good for playing your games directly off of a burned DVD or an import. However, the main goal in many recent years for GameCube modding is to boot up a program called Swiss, which is kind of, as the name implies, it is like the Swiss Army knife of just homebrew for the GameCube. This is an incredibly awesome program because it allows you to not only load games, but even run different modifications on them as well too. And it's not just like doing random mods on your games, it's really, you can use cheats on them, you can change region settings, you can also do some basic things like forcing 480p. So if you're using a original DOL 001 GameCube and you're outputting through, a component cable or an HDMI adapter, then that's really nice to have because you can just force it onto pretty much any game. So that's typically what people have been doing in recent years. You really don't play games off a burned DVD, but the main reason for installing a drive chip was so you could burn Swiss to a DVD, pop that in, and then you can boot up Swiss when you're turning on your GameCube, and you could use any other method to play your games. Now, what other methods am I talking about? Well, of course, there are the methods of burning your disc, but we're not talking about that. There's also the GC loader, which actually omits the DVD drive here completely, so you don't use discs on there at all. And I'm not talking about that either. There's really two other main methods that people use, and it's going to be these two right here. These are pretty much the most common, with this one I would say being better than this one. Now, what are these? This here is the SD2SP2, which is an incredibly awesome little board which goes into the serial port 2 slot on the bottom of the GameCube, which has never really been used for anything. So don't worry, don't think that just because you're using this, you're going to be killing compatibility with some other accessory. No, the serial port 2 port was never really utilized. So this little board here allows you to, again, just plop this in the bottom of your GameCube and put all of your games in homebrew onto a micro SD card right here. So the idea is you would typically modify your drive board to burn a copy of Swiss, boot into that, and then you can play your games off of here through the micro SD card. Now, if you don't want to use this, or you just don't have a console which has the serial port 2, that's fine as well too. You can also use this, which every single console does have, and this is just one of these memory card to SD card adapters right here. Now, you can't just like save on here typically, but this again is pretty simple. It really just slots into your memory card, and from here you plug in a SD card and boom, you're able to play your games in homebrew off of this SD card. So either of these methods works fine, although again, if you do have to choose one and you want the better option, you really should be going with the SD2 SP2 right here. So that's the process that you would normally go through for this. Now, as opposed to using the drive board itself and using the XenoGC, well, we can completely omit that at this point. This mod is actually going to even work with GameCubes that do not have a optical drive or have a broken laser or anything else on there, because that was one big contingency which many people might be thinking of right now. You needed a working DVD drive. So at this point, we don't even have to worry about the DVD drive. We can just get rid of this. Now, when we install PicoBoot, it's going to work in tandem with one of these two devices, and you do have to have these here. What you'll do is you're going to install PicoBoot, which is a small little file that is pretty easy to flash over onto this. It is going to replace the firmware on here because it then turns this into a mod chip itself, and then you wire it up to the GameCube's motherboard itself. It then uses IPL injection, and IPL stands for initial program load. So what it's doing at that point is once it is installed and enabled in your GameCube, it's then going to be looking for either one of these memory card to SD card adapters with the SD card on it, or it's going to be looking for a SD2 SP2 with a SD card in there, well, a micro SD card. And it's going to boot up whichever program you set on your card to IPL.dol, which in this case is actually Swiss. So the idea here is you can then use this chip itself to boot up Swiss from one of these cards and then boot up your games in homebrew. It's a nicer and cleaner alternative, and it doesn't even require the DVD drive, as I said. So if you're worried about not having a working DVD drive, well, you don't have to worry about that. Oh, and in terms of compatibility, this is why I have both of these GameCubes here. This does work on all GameCubes across all regions. Even the Panasonic Q, which I don't have a Panasonic Q on hand, but it does work on the Panasonic Q. So again, this is awesome because it works on every single GameCube. Now, you will have to figure out which one you have, and it's pretty simple to do this. First of all, if you have the DOL 001, which in my opinion is the better one here, there's a couple ways that you can tell. You can look around the back, and if you have two of these ports here, then that means that you have a DOL 001. And this is good because this is the digital AV out, so you can use the component cables as well as any other type of open source component or HDMI modification on here. And you can also, of course, look on the bottom of the GameCube, look at the model number there. This is a DOL 001. This is also extra nice because, check this out, under here, that is where the SD2 SP2 goes. So like I said, it just goes right here where the serial port 2 is. You take your SD2 SP2, you put the micro SD card in there with your software already set up, and then you just pop it in like so, close it up, and that's all there is to it. So boom, this GameCube is all ready to go. Now, this other GameCube is the newer model, which is the DOL 101, and there's a couple ways you can tell on here. First of all, it only has an AV out, so unfortunately without more modifications, we cannot pull nice digital AV out of here. Secondly, of course, flip it over, and if it says DOL 101, then that is the GameCube you have. I also don't like this one as much because check this out. It does not have the serial port 2 anymore, unfortunately. So unless you are going to be hardwiring in, which this guide is not going to cover, you cannot use the SD2 SP2 as standard on here. So this one already has the mod installed, the PicoBoot mod. But if you take your memory card adapter that has your games already on it, and of course Swiss on the SD card itself, you can plug it in, and there you go, you're all ready to rock on this GameCube. So now that I've explained that, we are going to need a few things to get started on here. This is going to require soldering. So if you're not comfortable soldering, well, unfortunately, you are going to do that for this. This video is not going to show you and teach you the basics of soldering and all that. So this is going to assume you already have basic soldering skills. You have the hardware already on there, such as like wire strippers, flux, isopropyl alcohol, all that fun stuff. So it's not going to go into the nitty-gritty basics, but if you learn a few things along the way, that is awesome. You are going to need, of course, a Raspberry Pi Pico to do this. I'm showing just the standard Pico itself right here, but there are a few Picos that you can get. So this is just the standard Raspberry Pi Pico. This is the best one that you can use. However, shortly after this modification was released, the Raspberry Pi Pico W was actually announced, and the difference with this one here is that the Pico W has Wi-Fi capabilities on the board. Now, according to webhdx, they are saying that according to reports, it could work, but the green LED might not show up, meaning that you're not going to be able to tell right off the bat if this modification is working or not, which can be confusing. However, it is planned to have Pico W full support in a future update if it is not already out there right now at the time this video does release. But the point is, really, the Pico W should work, and there will be compatibility at some point, like proper compatibility, but the Pico, just the standard one, is going to be your best bet. There was also another Pico that got quietly released called the Pico H, and this one is not the W. This is the exact same as the standard Pico. However, you're going to notice right here, the H stands for headers, meaning that a pin header has already been installed on here. Now, you can use this, but I personally would not recommend it just because we're going to be putting this somewhere in the GameCube and there's not all too much space in there. So if you have the ability to get one of these standard Picos, you can see it's nice and flat and we're just going to run our wires on the back. This would be perfectly fine. However, if you're going to be using the H model, it's still going to work the same since the guts are going to be the exact same. However, you are going to run into more issues, I guess, with the form factor itself. That is why I don't necessarily recommend getting the Pico H. Just get the standard Pico if you can, or I guess get the W. I've been showing these little devices here, the SD2 SP2, as well as the memory card adapter, and you are going to need a micro SD card or a SD card or a micro SD card with an SD card adapter, depending on what you're going to use. Again, I recommend you look on the bottom of your GameCube, and my suggestion would be, if you have access to the serial port 2, get yourself the SD2 SP2 and get a micro SD card. If you do not have that and you only have access to the memory card slot, get yourself the memory card adapter and then get a micro SD card to SD card adapter, or just get a full size SD card. Whichever one of these is going to be fine, but this is going to be required for PicoBoot in order to boot up Swiss. To get into the GameCube, you're going to need a Gambit screwdriver. Something like this would be nice, and once you're inside the GameCube, you are going to need 1 or 2 size smaller bit Phillips head screws. It's fine, this is typically how these systems work. Yeah, they don't really want you to get into them, so you do need the Gambit screwdriver, but once you're inside, it's all Phillips head screws, so it's funny how that works. Now, to secure this inside of the GameCube, many people have been using double-sided tape, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. If you want to use double-sided tape, that's fine. However, what I ended up using was something a little bit different. I used one of these Command 1 wall strips, and the reason why I did this is simple, because I had these on hand and I don't have double-sided tape on hand. But either way, you can get creative and you can use something like this. This one, you just end up removing these two to show the adhesive. You plop this on like so, and you put this onto the side of the GameCube's optical drive itself, so you can get it secured and it's not going to be moving around everywhere. But just something to stick this physically inside the GameCube will help. Lastly, I do want to talk about wiring because this is going to be important, and this actually did hang me up while doing the install. If you're like me, you might prefer to use 30 gauge Kynar wire or wrapping wire. This is just a single strand, so it's just a solid core. It's not stranded or anything, which makes it easier to work with and it takes up less space and such. This stuff is nice. However, when it comes down to this, not only your wires need to be short, because this is a little bit, it relies on timing, so you do need shorter wires when you're doing this installation, but you are also going to need something beefier than 30 gauge for the power and the ground. Yeah, I do know that there's been people who have gotten away with just using 30 gauge wire for everything and it has worked. Not only I'm not going to recommend that because my PicoBoot would not get any power power until I upped the gauge of wire on there. But on top of that, even webhdx himself recommends using at least 26 gauge wire for the power and the ground. For 30 gauge, you can use it for everything else, and there's only 5 wires to this install, so it's nice and easy, at least if you've done soldering on this level before. There's not too much work here. That is why for this, what I'm going to be using, and if you want to follow this, I can recommend it as well too, is for 3 of the wires, I ended up using this stuff here, just this wire, wrapping wire as it shows here, Kynar wire. Again, just getting 30 gauge and getting it in a solid piece, like a solid core if you can, so it's not going to be stranded. However, for the power and ground wires, I ended up using 26 gauge. You can see this stuff is thicker, and again, this worked out well because my PicoBoot would not get power when it was all wired up to the GameCube until I upped the wiring. So if you want to use 26 gauge for the entire install, you can, but for me, I use 26 gauge for the power and ground, and then I use the 30 gauge for everything else. I'm just really highlighting and stressing this here because I do not want anybody to get hung up on this same thing if they wire everything up and they're not getting power to their PicoBoot. It's probably because you're using too thin of wire for the power and ground. So there we go, we're pretty much all ready to go at this point here. Now to get into the install, let's actually tackle the software side of house first. Not only it is easier to do, but it's actually going to be required. And it's going to be so much easier to just do it now and get it out of the way. So I'm going to show you all this setup on here. First of all, you are going to need your Raspberry Pi Pico. You're going to need to go over to a computer that has internet so we can download the files that we need. That's going to be for PicoBoot. And to set up Swiss, which again is going to be required for this, go ahead to pick your device that you're going to be using, grab your micro SD card or your SD card, and again, hook that up to your computer as well too. We're going to get Swiss set up, and I'll also show you how to set up games real quick, as well as homebrew. Alright, so over at your computer, let's go ahead and get the Pi Pico flashed with PicoBoot. What you can do is go to the link down below in the description for PicoBoot, and you can check out the project right here from webhdx. Now, I would recommend giving this a nice once over because it is really well written right here. It's not all too difficult of a read, and check this out, there's even a hardware installation diagram so you can get some nice, lovely photos showing where to install everything. Of course, I'm going to show it in this video, but even if you just want it in photo form, webhdx has done a great job with this. There's also frequently asked questions which are covered here as well too, which is incredibly valuable because, for example, when I mentioned just now with the wires being at least 26 gauge, yep, that was absolutely correct, and it was found right here in the guide, and that is what worked for me. So go ahead and keep that all in mind here. Now what you can do is once you work through all of this and you just give it a quick read, make sure you understand that, and then over here we can go ahead, come back up to the top of the page, go over to releases, and download the latest release of PicoBoot right here. It's going to be a UF2 file. Just download that and save it somewhere you can easily find it. Next, we're going to need our most important application here right after PicoBoot, which is going to be Swiss. Now, this is incredibly great as well too if you have never used it before, and again, going to be another GitHub link that you can find down below in the description. I'd recommend giving this a quick once over as well too, just so you get a basic understanding of how to utilize it and such on here. But once you get all this read, you can come back up to the top, go to releases, and just like before, you're going to want to download the latest release available. Now, the version that you're going to want to download is just the standard 7Z. There's going to be a few files here. There's going to be the inkit one, the tar.xz file, but really just get the 7Z file and download the latest release available. Since that is going to be a 7-zip archive, if you do need to extract it and you don't have the software, you can download 7-zip, which will be linked down below in the description as well too. Just go ahead, download, install this, and you should be all ready to extract what you need. Now let's go ahead and get PicoBoot set up first. These should be the 2 files that you have downloaded. Now for PicoBoot, this is pretty simple. You're going to want to take a micro USB cable and hook it up to your computer. Then you're going to want to grab your Raspberry Pi Pico and you're going to hold down the boot select button or the boot cell button. It's the only button on the board itself. Hold that down, and while you're holding it down, hook it up to your computer through micro USB. If you have your speakers up, you should hear a sound indicating that you have connected a drive to your computer. And if you see this RPI RP2 drive under your Explorer window here, you can go ahead and now let go of the boot select button, but be sure you still have this hooked up to your computer. Again, you do have to do it in that order because it is important so we get it into bootloader mode so we can install this. Now, all you need to do is go over to your RPI RP2 drive, and you should only have 2 files right here. Now go ahead, copy the PicoBoot file, and paste it right here. Even though it's only 1 megabyte, it's going to take a few seconds to copy over. And there we go. When your window automatically closes, you should also get a green light on your Raspberry Pi Pico. That means it has been installed successfully. You can now disconnect the Raspberry Pi Pico, and congratulations, you've installed PicoBoot. It's as easy as that. That's all you had to do. So the PicoBoot software installation is completely done. Next up, we're going to be working on Swiss, and for this, you're going to need the SD card or micro SD card that you're going to be using with your memory card adapter or your SD to SP2. Now, grab the Swiss archive that you've downloaded, and if you're using 7-zip, you can right-click, go to 7-zip, and extract it here. It should all extract into its own Swiss folder. Now go ahead, open this, and you're going to want to navigate to the DOL folder. And there's going to be this file right here, which is going to be Swiss_R with the revision number you've downloaded .dol. This is the exact one that we need. You can go ahead, plug in your micro SD card or SD card, and we're going to format it as well too. Now do keep in mind, this is going to erase anything that you have on your drive, so make sure you have backed that up and it is somewhere safe if it's any data that you care about. But for this, I have my SD card plugged in. I'm going to right click, format this, and there's 2 formats that we can use. We can either use FAT32 or we can use exFAT. Now, I will say this is going to be compatible with both of them, and the main difference here is that FAT32 does not allow for a single file greater than 4 gigabytes, while as exFAT does. And also, it's a little bit trickier to format a larger drive to FAT32. It's not impossible, it's just, it requires like one little extra step. But this would be my recommendation here. Really, there's not too much of a difference between these two for our usage, because GameCube games do not exceed 1.4 gigabytes in size, ever, per disc. So the 4 gigabyte file limit is not going to matter on here. So for that, I will say, if you are formatting your drive regularly, I'd recommend if you have FAT32 available, just format it to FAT32. You can select this, default allocation size is fine, quick format is fine, start, OK, and that's it. However, if you do not have FAT32 available, exFAT is perfectly fine as well too. Exact same thing there, exFAT, default, quick format, OK, and that's it. Whichever file system you're going to use is going to be perfectly fine for this. Either way, I have formatted that now 3 times while talking, so we are all good to go on this. Now, this is what you need to do. You're going to want to, again, go into your Swiss folder, go into the DOL folder, and grab the Swiss revision.dol file. You don't want the ELF or the compressed one, just grab the regular one. You can right-click, copy this out, go back over to your micro SD card or your SD card and paste it into the root of the SD card. Now, once it's copied over, this is going to be super important. You're going to want to rename this to IPL.dol. It should look exactly like this. So it should no longer be called Swiss, it should just be called IPL.dol. And if you're using Windows, you can also click on View and enable file name extensions. So that way it needs to be exactly like this, IPL.dol. Once you have that all set up, your Swiss has now been set here as well too. The last thing that we can do is put games and homebrew on here, so I'll show you how to do that. Now, I have a few games that I have backed up right here, and I just want to show these as a demonstration. Now, the cool thing is you can just put them into the root of this directory here, or even if you want to create a new folder and call it like games or something like that, you can do that as well too. Either way is going to work however you're going to organize it, as long as you can find it. Typically for myself, I like to just put them in the root of the folder. Now, for single disc games such as Turok Evolution, this all you need to do, you need to copy out your ISO file and paste it wherever you're going to be putting it. Again, for me, that's going to be the root of this drive. So that's easy enough. We're just going to let that copy over. Perfect. So now with a single disc game copied over, I'm also going to show you how to copy over multi-disc games, because I'm sure people are going to be a little bit confused or concerned on that. And for multi-disc games, as you can see, I've picked Resident Evil, I have disc 1, and I have disc 2. And to copy these over, well, guess what? It is exactly as easy as it was for a single disc game. You just need to copy both of them out, disc 1 and disc 2, and the only thing you need to keep in mind is they need to be in the same directory. So again, if you have a folder called Games, for example, you need to put both discs into the Games folder. If you're just going to put them out in the root of the drive, like I'm showing right here, they both need to be right here. But either way, you just paste them in, and there you go. Thanks to Swiss having some automatic disk switching on there. Again, as long as you have both disks for your game in the same directory, or they're just next to each other there, then you should be all good to go. So here we go. We now have both those disks copied over, and it should look a little something like this. Yet again, if you're using a multi-disc game, both the disks need to be next to each other or in the same directory. Lastly, for homebrew, it's just as easy as everything else, and I decided just for this example to grab clean rip here, but it's pretty simple to do. You can just go ahead, open up your homebrew, so your zip file, and it should look a little something like this. It's going to be in a .dol format if it's going to be GameCube, and quite literally for this as well too, you just copy out whichever dol file you're using and paste it right here, wherever you're going to be using it. Whether it's going to be in the root of this directory next to all your games, or you can call it something like homebrew, and put it in there, or if you're going to use emulators, you can do anything on this. The point is, whichever comfortable method you're going to use for organizing, that's going to be up to you, as long as you can find it. But really, once you boot up Swiss from this ipl.dol, which will automatically do it, you can then launch any of your ISOs, or you can go into your homebrew and you can launch the dol file right there. So there we go, we've covered single disc games, multi-disc games, as well as any type of homebrew or emulators. And of course, we've set up Swiss. So now with all of this complete, we can come back here, right click, and safely eject our USB drive or our card there. At this point, you're now going to want to take your micro SD card or your SD card and just pair it up with your device, whether that is the memory card adapter or the SD2 SP2. We're going to now work on getting the GameCube ripped apart and installing everything in here, but do keep in mind that this is going to be required. So once we have our GameCube up and running with the PicoBoot, you are going to have to hook up either that memory card adapter with the SD card or the SD2 SP2 with the micro SD card. Alright, now let's go ahead and get this GameCube disassembled. First of all, remove any game discs and disconnect any accessories you might have, including power, memory cards, any of that stuff. Flip the GameCube upside down, and we're going to take out the 4 game bit screws. These are going to be easy enough to find, so you will need your game bit size screwdriver, and they're just going to go into the 4 deepest holes on the bottom of the GameCube. Once these 4 screws have been taken out, you can flip the GameCube right side up and then gently remove the top casing of the GameCube itself. I did a little bit of a shake right there because one of the screws just would not come out, so you might have to do that. But as you can see, once you take this off, you're able to see a lot of the internals of the console here. Now this console has definitely seen better days, so while you're in here, it might be a good excuse to clean it as well too. But let's take off some of the bigger pieces. If you come around from the back here, you can kind of just remove this plastic bit on the back of the console like so, and keep it somewhere safe. Now come around to the front of the console, and we can also remove the controller board right here. It kind of just pops off like that, but be careful, there is going to be a ribbon cable that attaches to the motherboard itself, so gently pull up on that. Now good news, once we're inside the console, the rest of the screws are all Phillips head screws, so we're going to need some Phillips head bits. Make sure that you take a smaller bit here, and we're going to remove these 4 screws on top of these pieces that reside on top of the memory card ports. What I do is I just loosen each of these here, so both of these screws on each one, and then remove it with the metal piece that it comes with, and just keep it all together like that. We can now switch to a larger bit, and from here we can work on the rest of the screws. So if you come over to the right side of the console, there's going to be 5 gold screws right there. Just go ahead, remove all of those, and keep them somewhere safe. If we rotate the console around over to the left-hand side, there's going to be 2 screws right here, which are going to hold in the fan itself. Go ahead and remove these 2 screws, and then remove the fan. Now don't just yank this out, you're going to want to be a little gentle and move this to the side because there's going to be 3 screws hiding underneath this. Just remove these 3 as well. Great, now we can come around to the back side of the GameCube, and well, there's not too much of a surprise here. There's 4 screws around the back. Remove these 4 as well. Once all the screws have been removed, you can just lift up like that, and there you go. The entire shield alongside with the optical drive has been removed. So your GameCube should look a little something like this. Now, if you look at the heatsink, there's going to be 6 small screws, which are going to be holding it to the GameCube's motherboard and attaching it all in. You're going to want to remove all 6 of these screws. Now with all of those screws removed, what I do is I come around to the ports here and pull up gently on them, as you can see, because the GameCube motherboard can be physically removed from the rest of the console itself. So I'm going to move all of this over to the side because we don't need that bottom part of the GameCube, and we're just going to focus on the motherboard now. Now we need to focus on removing this heatsink. You want to make sure that you're not going to knock off any components, and this is what I do. I kind of hold down the motherboard and I wiggle the heatsink back and forth on each side to kind of loosen it up. And when I feel like I have it loose enough, I start to gently lift up on it. I do this because I still want to keep the thermal pads intact, which you're going to see right here. Not perfect, but we have a pretty good lift on them. So here you go. At this point, this should be where you're at, just working with a naked GameCube motherboard. Now this specifically is the DOL 001, and this is what we're going to be working with here. If you have a DOL 001, all of our components are going to be on the top of the GameCube motherboard that we need to work with. Skipping a bit ahead, but this is what an install on a DOL 001 motherboard would look like by the end. However, if you have a DOL 101 motherboard, you're still going to solder to the top of the motherboard, but you're also going to be soldering here to the bottom of the motherboard. So that's going to be about the only difference. Let's go ahead and grab our Raspberry Pi Pico. It should look a little something like this. Now the nice thing is you can solder the wires here to the top and or bottom of the board. What I like to do here is I like to solder to the bottom of the board so that way I can kind of route them that way underneath. Let's go ahead and get our wires tacked on to this. First, let's work on 3v3. What I do here is take a few drops of liquid flux and dab them onto the 3v3 point. From here, I then take a 26 gauge wire. It is recommended to use at least 26 gauge for 3v3 and get it soldered in right here. I'll show you how I do this. What I like to do is make sure the end of the wire has been exposed, get some solder onto the tip of your soldering iron, and just tack it in like this. It doesn't have to look pretty, it just has to be tacked in. Don't worry, we're going to come back to it. So once it's been tacked in like that, it looks like we're in about good shape for a starting point. If you want to touch up on this, well, that is going to be recommended. Now don't worry if it doesn't look great, we're going to fix that. What I do to fix that is add on some more flux, bring in some nice fresh solder, and make sure you add that to the point itself. Again, it helps to make sure this wire is first tacked in, and then we can make it look nicer. And as you can see, that is looking much nicer. So that's one of the wires done. Now we'll do the exact same thing with the ground point. Make sure you grab your wire at least 26 gauge, kind of loop it in like that, add some flux if you wish to, and then tack it in, just with some solder at the end of your soldering iron. Again, this doesn't have to look good right here, we just need to make sure it's tacked in. From here, I introduce some new solder, get it added on, and there we go. It's looking much nicer. Here you can see from the top and bottom, it is looking nice. It is looking exactly how we would expect it to look here. And we have these two important wires done. Now what I do here is bend the 3v3 and ground wires out of the way because we're now going to be working on the other side of the board here. Let's go ahead and get GP4 wired up. Just do the exact same thing as before, and at this point for these other points that we're going to be attacking, you can use smaller wires if you wish to. Again, if you want to use 26 gauge for your entire install, that's fine, but what I do here is 26 gauge for my 3v3 and ground, and then 30 gauge for the other 3 wires. Just do the exact same technique as before and you should be okay. We're going to do the exact same thing with another wire over on our GP5 point. Just do the exact same thing as before, or if you figured out a technique that works for you, go ahead and get that wire soldered in. Here's the only part of this technique that's really going to differ, because we're going to be soldering to 2 points with 1 wire. It's going to be GP6 and GP7. So I've already fluxed and tinned these 2 points right here, and then you're going to want to bring in a wire. Now, if you want to loop your wire into both of the holes and solder it up, you can do that if you wish to, but what I do is I tin both of these GP6 and GP7 points, and then I expose more of my wire than I normally would and kind of lay it across GP6 and GP7. Once I've securely laid it down, I just come in with my soldering iron and touch it to each point. That way the wire is able to get melted in with the solder and be attached to both points at the same time. This is important. You do need to have 1 wire across both of those points. Of course, if it's not to your liking, that can always be corrected. I just add some new flux to this. I bring in some new solder and make sure it is ready for prime time right here. Once I attack these 2 points with some fresh solder, I think we're good to go. So here we go. At this point, all of our wires have been soldered in. There's not too many we need to work with, but once you are done and happy with your work, make sure you've hit the right points and then come in here, and I'd recommend cleaning these up. I just take a Q-tip with some isopropyl alcohol and clean up all the points that I've soldered the wires to on the chip itself. Once you're happy with how everything is turned out on your chip, at this point we can turn our sights over to the GameCube because we can work on our installation. Now, regardless of which GameCube model we have, these points right here are going to be the same, so we're going to focus on these 3 points. Now we're going to really zoom in here for this shot, but we're going to focus on our ground wire. So what you can do is come over to the 2 points you're going to be attacking for ground, and first clean them up with some isopropyl alcohol and something else like a Q-tip. That's what I've done right here. Next up, to make our soldering easier, we can also come in with a bit of flux. It looks like I'm using a ton here, but trust me, it's not all too much. This is all just under a microscope. Now, since we're going to be attacking at 2 points, what we can do here is introduce some fresh solder to each of these points, just like this, so it should look nice and shiny on each point. And from here, if you can manage it, just go ahead, take your wire, line it up next to each of these points right here, and then come in with some fresh solder on your soldering iron and hit both of them like so. As you can see, we have now connected our wire to both of those points, so our ground wire is complete. It should look a little something like this. With our ground point completed, we're going to move over a little bit and we're going to wire up our GP5 wire. Do not get this confused for 3v3, just make sure you count this out properly. You'll just want to do the same thing as before. Go ahead, come in here, give this a nice clean, and then also flux it. It would help out. Now, just like before, what I do is I come in here with some fresh solder, and I make sure I tin this point properly. Now, it was a little bit tricky for me to navigate this here, but it should look a little something like this, where you have fresh, shiny solder on that point to make this all easier. I had to attempt this a few times here, but once I got it, you should have a little something like this. And as you can see, that'll work for what we need it for. Now, since our GP5 wire is done, we're just going to come over to another point here for 3v3 and do the exact same thing we've been doing. Just get some flux over here and make sure your 3v3 point is going to be tinned. it's just going to be 2 down from the GP5 point. So we should get a little something like this. There we go, we introduce some new fresh solder, and we are ready to get this going. Now go ahead, come in here with your iron and your wire, and get the wire soldered into 3v3. Now this didn't take me all too long, but I did hit this a few times just because I wasn't initially happy with it, so I'm actually going to keep this full attempt in here. And here we go. At this point, these 3 wires have been soldered up. Alright, now this is where this will differ. We need to locate a chip to solder the last 2 wires to. If you're using a DOL 001, it will be on the top of the board. However, if you're using a DOL 101, you'll have to flip your board over and locate the same chip. It's right there, it's just on the bottom of the motherboard. The good news is, despite the chip being in a different location between 2 motherboards, the points are going to be the exact same that we're going to solder to. So first of all, let's solder our wire that we're going to use for GP6 and 7. Yes, it's going to be that one wire that is spread across 2 points. We're going to be attacking this leg right here, so go ahead, clean it, flux it, and now we're going to tin this point just to make this a little easier. From here, I just introduce some fresh solder, and there we go. Now just bring in your wire that you're using for GP6 and GP7 and get it soldered in. I'm going to showcase this full point as well too, because it took me a few tries to get this, but I was happy with the result in the end, so it was worth a few attempts. And there we go, we now have this point done. Let's go ahead and get one last wire soldered in. Since we're all happy with our wire for GP6 and GP7, come to the other side of this chip and we're going to solder in our final wire for GP4. Just like before, if you need to clean this, go ahead, but once it's clean, I would recommend fluxing up this leg and then introduce some fresh solder to it in order to get it tinned for our wire. This is probably the angle I was working at, but for whatever reason, I got this point done much easier. For here, just do the same thing as before, bring in your wire for GP4 and get it soldered in. Excellent, we're all done. So there we go, the physical installation for PicoBoot is complete. Now here, make sure your work is cleaned up. We have cleaned up our wiring on the chip itself, but on the points that are soldered to the GameCube, just come in here with some isopropyl alcohol, and if you have a Q-tip and or even an old toothbrush of some kind that is only used for this, just make sure you get any spare flux cleaned up from your points themselves. You should be proud of your install, and I hope you are, but we just need to make sure we're leaving this in a nice clean state before we button everything up for testing. Now for the rest of this reassembly, I'm actually using my DOL 101 GameCube, and trust me, this thing has seen better days. I have no idea what the previous owner put this system through, so you can see a little bit of rusting in some spots if you do notice that. But either way, I do have the bottom cleaned up as well. Go ahead and grab the bottom piece of your GameCube that we put over to the side and slot your GameCube motherboard into place. It should go a little something like this. Now, if all your wires are on the top of the system like a DOL 001, it should be a little easier, but if you have a DOL 101, just be aware of the 2 wires at the bottom. Thankfully, with these 30 gauge wires, they are thin enough that they are not being crushed between the motherboard and the chassis. So we are good there if you use thin enough wires. Now go ahead, grab your heatsink and plop it on top of all the chips. Make sure that you do have thermal pads there, but if you need to replace them, this would be a good opportunity to do so as well too before you button everything up. Now if you do have a DOL 001 GameCube, you will have to watch out for the chip that we soldered 2 wires to because it is directly underneath the heatsink. So what I'd recommend doing is make sure you move the wires off to the side so they're not crushed, but also make sure we're not going to screw anything through them. Now, if you want to, you can run your wires through the left side of the GameCube itself and up, but what I'm doing right here is actually a tip I have seen online. If your wires are thin enough,
what you can actually do is, check this out, run them right through the middle of the GameCube right here, like what I'm doing. So what I'm doing is kind of just making sure everything is flattened out, making sure, at least trying to minimize the wires overlapping. And then at this point here, I just bring the top of the GameCube itself, which is the optical drive with everything attached, pop it on like so, and it might not seem like it, but there is enough room right there in the middle of the GameCube that the wires are able to go through just fine. And then you can bring up your Raspberry Pi Pico and move it somewhere like right here. If you have a dull 101 GameCube with the 2 wires running to the bottom of the console, I was able to do about the same thing. What I did here was I made sure my wire placement was looking good enough right there, and then I made sure my controller board was able to connect in just fine. From here, it is still a little bit tricky to do, but if you want to, you can run your wires through the middle of the console, just like I did on the 001. The only caveat here being I did have to flip my chip upside down, so you're going to see the Raspberry Pi Pico is upside down right here, but it really doesn't matter as long as it is all wired in successfully and it is working. So there we go, we're able to do about the same thing, and I'm going to place it somewhere right here, just behind the controller board. Now here we go, when we're reassembling everything, I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty detail, but I did want to cover the actual chip placement here. You see, I'm going to be putting it right here, and I'm running the wires through the middle because for this we do want to keep our wires somewhat short. And I found a thankfully good spot right here. If you want to find a different spot, you're more than welcome to do that, but this is where you need to get a little bit creative on sticking this somewhere it will be secured. Now, a lot of people do use double-sided tape for this. As I said earlier, I don't have any double-sided tape on hand, but I did have these really nice Command branded wall strips, which just look at this, they fit perfectly on the Pi Pico. All I did was expose the adhesive end on one side and attached it to the bottom of the Pico here. Then I exposed the other end of the adhesive strip, and then I attached it right here on the plastic itself. It seems to work well enough in that position. And if you want to insulate the top of the chip, you're more than welcome to, but I just keep mine behind the controller board right there. Once you have your chip placed, just continue with the rest of the reassembly, and once you have everything reassembled, you are going to need to plug this into power, AV, but you're also going to need, in order to work with PicoBoot, you will need your SD card or micro SD card that we set up, as well as your adapter of choice that you have settled on. At this point, once you have everything plugged in and ready to go, let's get to the GameCube itself. I just want to highlight this here real quick. If you boot up your GameCube and it boots up completely normal with no difference in performance right here, that means that even if you do have the Raspberry Pi Pico installed with PicoBoot flashed on there and everything is all well and good, your SD card or micro SD card is probably not hooked up. You might have forgotten to do that, or it might not be recognized on here. Again, make sure it is formatted properly. You do have that file where it needs to be, the ipl.dol file, and you do have your SD card or micro SD card connected up to your device you're using, whether that be the memory card adapter or the SD2 SP2. Either way, this GameCube I know for sure does have it installed, so I am going to pop my memory card adapter in here and restart the GameCube. Now, if all is in place successfully, you should get a little something like this when you turn on your GameCube from cold boot. As you can see, I do have my SD card recognized, and we are in the Swiss menu. So let's go ahead and give this a quick once over. You can see here that I have my homebrew in here. It's just going to show up like this as a dull file. If we go back, we do have our 2-disc game of Resident Evil and our single-disc game of Turok Evolution, as well as the IPL.dol, which is going to be for Swiss. Now, when you are making your configurations and such, you're probably also going to get this Swiss folder, which is going to be where your configuration files for Swiss are going to reside. Now, if you want to modify your configuration on here, there are a few things I can recommend. First of all, you can press the B button on your controller, and you're going to see that the focus will go down to these options on the bottom of the screen. Let's go ahead and hit the gear right here, which is going to be our settings. Press A to go in here, and here are global settings that you can tweak. Now for some of the settings here that we can go over, there's a ton on here as you can see, but for Swiss video mode, for example, this is just whichever video mode resolution you're going to output on here. Now this depends on your configuration. Now for me, I'm using a GameCube that has a HDMI adapter thanks to the digital output on this, but this is set to auto by default. Now you can force the resolution for Swiss here to something else, such as 480p, which I'm going to do here just as an example. And if you want to make these changes globally here, you can do save and exit, and it saves it. I'm going to go back in here real quick because we can look at a few other things. So I'm going to go to next. These are network settings, which of course you can tweak if you want to, if you have the broadband adapter for this. I do not on here, so I'm going to go next. Now there's some extra advanced settings here, and if any of these seem to be like something you would be using, then you can enable or disable them at will. And lastly here, I do say lastly even though there's 4 out of 5 pages, these are going to be default game settings that you can set. Now right here, the one that I personally like, which this can be helpful for people who are using one of those HDMI adapters or even the component cables. If you're using the digital out on here, you can actually force the video mode of your game. So as you can see, you have several resolutions available, and for this, I would like to use 480p, so that's mainly what I'm going to use here. Now, because this is global, this is going to set automatically for pretty much any game we boot up on here. But I'll also go to next, and the last page is just for specific game settings if you want to tweak them per game. You can also check out the information on your GameCube if you'd really like to. So your system information, this is all just neat stuff to see here. Of course, the credits as well too. You can also refresh this if you so choose. Now check this out. For this last option here, if you ever want to boot into your main GameCube configuration, or I guess the main menu, just the standard GameCube boot up, you can do that just by pressing this button right here. It will soft reset your GameCube and you will be able to access this menu here. And this is quite useful if you ever need to change your date and time settings, maintain data on your memory card, adjust any of the other options here. You got all this, so that's great. Now let's go ahead and do a full power cycle of the GameCube again to get back to Swiss. Here we go, we got everything set up. I do want to show you as well too, if you want to cycle between your game menu here, or just your file explorer and the options down below, you just do that with the B button. If you tap the B button, you can access these options here. If you tap it again, you come back to your file explorer. Now I do want to show this last thing here. You all remember where I ended up changing this setting, which we're going to find it in the next page or even the page after that, I believe. Really, it's just highlighting the option right here to force a resolution. Well, check this out. We can actually see that in effect. This again is useful if you ever want to play using component cables or an HDMI adapter, and I would recommend it for that. Now, many games on the GameCube have an option for progressive mode, which means that you'll be able to play the game in progressive as opposed to interlaced, and it looks much nicer. And if you're playing with an HDMI adapter or component cables, that is what you need to be aiming for. Now check this out. Typically, we would have to pick one of these games, and we would have to hold down a button to enable that configuration. But instead of doing that, since we have that setting in place on Swiss, all we need to do is select our game, press A yet again. Video mode is 480p, it patches the file here, and let's give it a few seconds to run. As you can see in the top corner right there, it says 640 by 480p. I'll go ahead and continue without save, but we were able to get this game running in 480p with no issue. And this is nice as well too, because there are apparently many other games on the GameCube which by default do not support that progressive scan mode. However, if you force it using Swiss, you can actually boot the game into progressive scan. Of course, your mileage may vary. There might be some games that will have issues with this, but for the most part, it seems to work pretty well, which is incredibly awesome to see. You can even just see right here, the start screen is pretty nice and clear. I'll go ahead and press start, and I just want to get in game game real quick. Here we go, we have a scene in the game that is running in engine, and as you can see in 480p, it definitely looks a lot cleaner. So that is why if you're going to be using component cables or an HDMI cable, I do recommend setting that setting so you can just automatically have Swiss Force 480p or just one of those progressive scan resolutions into the game that you're going to be playing. Well, here we go. We're at the end of the road. Hopefully you have a successfully working GameCube with PicoBoot installed in there, and if you do, hopefully this helped out and you can have some fun with your GameCube. I do want to give a big shout out and thank you to webhdx for his work on releasing PicoBoot to the community. This is absolutely awesome, and of course his GitHub is going to be linked to this project down below in the description if you do want to support him further or read up on this further, which I would recommend either way. It's been really awesome to see this and utilize it, because even though personally I do like GC loader for the GameCube, that does carve out the entire optical drive, and I know not everyone is going to want to do that. It's also a bit more of a costly solution, but to me it seems like PicoBoot is the perfect solution between being extremely cost effective and getting a whole lot more usage out of your GameCube, because even with this, if you have a broken optical drive or it's even missing from your GameCube, you don't need it at this point, so you can save everything even further. Or if you still want the ability to play discs on your console, you don't have to sacrifice that. You're simply adding features to the GameCube by installing PicoBoot. This IPL method has been around for a while, but this is the first time we've really had it in easy, accessible form and in an affordable solution using the Raspberry Pi Pico. That's about all I have to say in this. I do know this video went on for quite a while, but I had a lot I wanted to show and a lot I wanted to say. Either way, this is Mr. Mario, signing off. Thank you all for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, a like would absolutely be appreciated, and if you didn't like it, a dislike is fine as well too.